The primary obligation of a parent is to serve as a proxy for the social and the natural world. But let's say the social world. Why? Well, because you want to train your child to be not only acceptable socially, but highly desirable socially. And the reason for that is that by the time they're about 3 to 4 is the transition period, they're going to be spending more time being socialized by their peers than by you. And that will increasingly be the case as they develop. And if you haven't encouraged them through judicious attention to be socially desirable, they're going to be rejected by their peers, and then they fall farther and farther behind on the developmental trajectory. That's partly how you help them with their identity. They can't be the sort of person that insists that everyone else always play the game they chose.
And it's honoring that they can play whatever game they want for themselves. Like your granddaughter, she can play Pocahontas, and if she wants to have that identity as Pocahontas, great. But to demand and to shame anybody who decides to call her Ellie, for example, who just doesn't know any better, knows that name. That's where I think it gets that's where the ugliness of it comes out. Like the freedom to express ourselves how we want, but then softening the edges of this thing and just recognizing, okay, if you know somebody and they really prefer to be called something. It was like when I was 30, I changed my name from one of my middle names was Chris and the other middle name was Aubrey. My legal name was Michael, and it was all a big mess. I decided to take my grandfather's name, Aubrey. So there was a window there where my identity changed, well, at least the name, from Chris to Aubrey. And so lots of people would call me Chris, and I would just gently say, hey, I changed my name to Aubrey. But whatever, it wouldn't it wouldn't be a screeching halt to the day or anything like that. And it would just be gentle encouragement that I didn't take personally, because I wasn't attached to that identity as the end all be all. I attached to, I am an infinite being, a locus of consciousness that is embodying a certain identity at this transitory time. This is my own personal spiritual belief. And that to me is the solid ground, right? So these other things, this is how we play. This is the way, as Ram Dass said, this is us being God in drag, right? Like this is us playing out our role. And it's, in my opinion, it's fine to play out another role. But the moment you get so attached to that infinitesimal aspect of self and build these walls rather than opening up the community, that's where I think it leads to the result, as you said, it leads to a result that you're not actually desiring in trying to do this, change this identity.
Well, that's what I saw as the danger, I would say, is that it was the use of force,
right?
Which is what happens when you put something into law. Force is not only implied, but relatively, stated relatively explicitly. And then there was the problem with the, paucity of identity and the interference with free speech. And I don't think that those concerns were misplaced. I think that there's something about that issue that's central to the continuing culture war. It is a war to some degree about what constitutes identity. But at least we should have a more sophisticated notion of identity. It's just not helpful otherwise. I mean, part of what I was doing constantly as a clinical psychologist was helping people craft an ever more sophisticated identity. And what you want to have the kind of identity that makes people line up to want to play with you. And if you ever have to use force, well, sometimes force is inescapable. But if you have to use force to get people to comply, it is a sign that you're not playing a very good game. Now, maybe you can't think up a better one. There's nothing that's going to work. A state of emergency might, because we allow governments to use extra force during a state of emergency. But nobody thinks that's optimal. Yep. So if people won't play because you're inviting them, then the game isn't configured very well, and it's very unlikely to be stable. So...
Yep. So as we're trying to, understand that thing that we're aiming at with our identity, just like your granddaughter's aiming at Pocahontas because of certain attributes that really resonate with her, a lot of us have an amalgamation of certain stories. I know for me, there's lots of heroic stories from, lots of times movies, sometimes different things. A play, Cyrano de Bergerac, was a major, cornerstone of an identity that I really admired. And when he said something like, when troubled by all the many possibilities that lay before me, I decided to be admirable at everything. I was like, aha, that's my guy. And then there is another aspect of something I saw from William Wallace.
That aha is a very interesting reaction. Mm-hmm. That's an insight response. It looks like it's right hemisphere mediated. And it is, I would say, the initial manifestation of the next stage of identity. So imagine that it's sort of a Piagetian theory in some sense. You're at a particular stage right now, and that stage would involve a particular worldview and the behaviors that go along with that. So the perceptions and behaviors. But it's not enough because you haven't mastered the whole world and you're making mistakes all the time. And then there's other neurological mechanisms so maybe that's a more left hemisphere phenomenon, the instantiation of that identity. Then there's right hemisphere mechanisms that are tracking your errors and and keeping track of them. And the errors are an indication that your theory is incomplete. So the errors accumulate and the information around the errors accumulate, and another identity starts to become formulated, and it solves all the problems your previous identity did, but also some additional ones. When you have an aha moment like that, it's the manifestation of that next identity that's making itself known. It's because it's being built from the bottom up. It isn't explicit yet. And then you'll encounter an explicit statement. You mentioned a couple there, and they map onto that. And that's the aha. It's like, oh yes, that's what ties together these things that I've been wrestling with in the back of my mind, right? Someone made it explicit. And that's that's one of the great things about language. That can also help fill in the gaps too, because then, you can start to make arguments based on that observation, that aha. That's the manifestation of the snitch too.
Yeah.
Like, bang! Oh look, that interested me. That's pulling me along somewhere. Where is it going? Well, hopefully, it's going to the next me. This is also why, in book 1 in 12 Rules, I said, don't tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Well, why? Well, fundamentally, because if you deceive yourself repeatedly, you mess up your identity. You mess up the neurology, for that matter. It no longer produces outputs that map on well to the world. What that'll mean is that your interest starts to become pathologized. And then you're really in trouble, because your interest manifests itself involuntarily. And so if you mess up the machinery that unconsciously orients you, that you don't have control over, but that has control over you, you're lost. You're lost. There's nothing that can lead you back. And that should terrify you 3/4 to death. It's like, don't mess with those unconscious instincts. Don't put garbage in the system so that you start being interested in things that are going to take you somewhere you don't want to go. So,
yeah. Or enmeshment with people. If you get enmeshed with another individual, a group of friends, that could be, or it could be a partner, and you start to have that groupthink phenomenon where all of a sudden their ideas become your ideas, which has nothing to do with your snitch and your daemon and your aspirational avatar that you're modeling yourself off, but you're just co-opting somebody else's.
Well, it's a tough
dangerous.
one, and I laid that out in both of these books. You're riding these two. You're caught between two forces which are very constructive and very destructive. So look, you have to go along with the crowd. The typical parent says to his teenage son or her teenage son, if Sam jumped off a bridge, would you jump off too? And the answer should be no, of course not. But not exactly. Maybe the bridge is 12 feet high and it's a test of courage. And you should jump off the damn bridge. And maybe going along with your friends means that you're being properly socialized, and you're doing it despite what your parents want. So that's actually a marker of independence. And maybe you're at a stage where succumbing to peer pressure means playing with others. Now, the danger is you lose your path, right? You gain what's common to you and everyone else, but you lose what's unique to you. But you can't say, well, just pursue your own unique individuality, mean, virtually every cartoon, animated movie now that's made for kids has the underlying theme of you're a unique individual and you should pursue your unique individuality. It's like, yeah, no, not exactly. First of all, that could be a form of insanity and could and might well be. And second, you have to be a cog in the machine. Now, you shouldn't be nothing but a cog in the machine. That's a mistake because the machine might malfunction and it might be headed in the wrong direction and all of that. It can be pathological. That's the pathology of order. But that doesn't mean that you can dismiss peer pressure and succumbing to it. It's like, well, yeah, psychopaths don't succumb to peer pressure ever.
And finding the balance between those extremes. This is a theme that shows up in so much of your work, which is highlighting these two extreme positions and then saying it's neither this or this, but it's both this and this to the certain appropriate degree.
In a dynamic, it's like music.
Yeah.
And I make that case in chapter 8, which is make one room in your house as beautiful as possible. Music speaks of the continual, harmony of what would you say? The balance of opposing forces, something like that. And it constantly changes and moves within a domain. You want to pursue that kind of harmonious balance. In the first chapter, I said, don't casually denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. And there's a political argument there, right? An implicit political argument, because the conservatives are on the side of the social institutions, by and large, and the liberals, by and large, are on the side of creative achievement. It's like, well, those two do exist in tension, but the tension can never be entirely resolved because creative achievement can undermine order. But order degenerates without being updated, and creative achievement updates. And so we're stuck with that. These are existential permanence. That's why in my first book, I called it The Architecture of Belief. And it's about what I think of as existential permanence. They never go away. You never, if you're human, you always have to deal with the pathology and utility of culture, with the danger and promise of nature, and with the good and evil that exist in your own soul. That's humanity. And no matter who you are, you have those problems. They'll never go away. And the solution is to constantly find a solution. Yeah. There's no final, death is the only final solution to that set of problems. It's juggling. And it's in the juggling that the solution is to be found. It's too bad because, and that's the problem with utopian thinking. This is why Dostoevsky, in his genius, realized, he said, look, if you gave people what they wanted, all the cake they could possibly eat, surrounded them with material comfort, and what did he say? Until they have nothing to do but busy themselves with the continuation of the species and eat cake. They would immediately break the structure. They'd tear it down violently just so something unexpected could happen. And I read that, that was in Notes from Underground. It just knocked me over. It's like, yes, that's right. There isn't a final state where everyone will be happy because they've been provided with what they need. It's God. It's not that simple.
No.
And there'd be no point in life, I suppose, if it was that simple, because you could just solve the problem and be done with it.